In this video, we're going to look at the third movement of the first Beethoven piano sonata, Opus 2, number 1, which is in the key of F minor. And we're looking at the Minuetto movement, this third movement. And this is a good example of minuet in trio form. So one of the things I talked about with the minuet is that it has a tempo that's not quite as fast as what you'll find in the typical scherzo. So allegretto is typical tempo marking for minuetto. And so, a little bit slower. And you're looking for that sense of contrast between the minuet, which is in the key of F minor, and then the trio section, which is in the parallel key of F major. So that's one thing that you always look for, is that contrast of key, and especially with Beethoven, that contrast of minor minuet with major trio section. You can also look for a contrast of texture, and in this particular minuet, you clearly have a homophonic texture, and you maintain that for the most part. This one passage here, this retransition passage, then both hands are playing the same line, so that's a contrast of monophonic texture there. But in general, you have homophonic texture in the minuet, and then in the trio section, we're going to see that Beethoven uses this technique of invertible counterpoint. And so what that term has to do with is describing the relationship between two voices. And if you're talking about two voices, the term double counterpoint is sometimes used, or if it's three voices, triple counterpoint. But it's a situation where you have the relationship between two voices where the upper voice can then be placed into the lower register, and what was the lower voice can then be placed into the higher register with good results. So you're going to have a lot of emphasis on thirds and sixths, which when inverted become sixths and thirds and so forth. So that is a technique that's associated with contrapuntal writing, and so that is something that you'd want to point out in this work, and is a good reason for calling this a polyphonic texture. So you see that situation in this part 1 of the trio, and then in part 2 here after the double bars, it's going to have the same thing where the eighth notes are in the right hand, and now he switches those down into the left hand, and what was dotted half notes in the left hand now is placed into the right hand, and it leads to the climax of this. This is kind of an interesting place where you have double fourths in the right hand, and this is the climax of the piece, and then you have a little retransition that takes you then to part 3 where that returns the opening again. So anyway, you have that contrast of texture of homophonic and polyphonic here as well, and then you're always looking to see if this has new thematic material, which it does, and so that meets all the criteria for the typical minuet and trio. So you want to look to see if the minuet and trio uses a da capo at the end of the trio, which this one does. And so one of the things that you'll expect is that would then be performed without taking the repeat. So on the da capo, you'll hear this played straight through, and then the movement will end with that repetition of parts 1, 2, and 3 here of the minuet. So in looking at this particular work, it's really straightforward, nothing too unusual about it at all. It is written in 4-measure phrases, and this two-note slur is a motive that he's going to work with a lot. So you'll hear that in the first 2 measures. And then also you have this used at the cadence point where you've got an imperfect authentic cadence, but this is an example of a delayed cadence because of the use of that appoggiatura, which then resolves. And so that two-note slur is an idea that he's going to use consistently. So he on the second phrase, then he then sequences this idea on the relative major key, A flat, and he has a repetition in these two measures, and you can see how this is just going to repeat this right here, and he's going to place that in the lower voice. So he just switches these voices around. He takes these E flats and puts them up in the upper voice, and then he takes the top voice here and he places it here. And so that is a dissolution technique of extending this four-measure phrase. So 1, 2, 3, 4 by two measures. And then you have a third phrase that is presented. And so that makes then for an A prime, and a B, and so that part one would be a phrase group. The overall key of this is F minor, and it cadences then on A flat major on the relative major key, and then that's repeated. So that's a typical key relationship of minor tonic to relative major. All right, so part two begins after the double bars. And with this, you're still working with that two-note slur idea. That's the main motive of the minuet. And you have a little bit of imitation here between the hands where this is one beat off. So you hear this in the right hand, but then this, imitates it in the left hand one beat later. And it continues to do that. And then that's a four-measure phrase. And then you have a second phrase here. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he's going to just take the end of this material and he's going to repeat it. So again, this uses a lot of dissolution, of extending the end of the phrase with repetition of that ending material. And so you had a four-measure phrase here, and then you basically had 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a two-measure extension. So six-measure phrase there. So part two is just a contrasting period. And then we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, four-measure retransition. And I mentioned that this was monophonic texture. You see here it makes a big contrast of dynamics. So when you hear it played, it's real jarring, to hear that passage that leads to the return. And then when part three begins here with the upbeats, just like it began with an upbeat in part one, the thematic material now is placed in the upper fingers of the left hand. So you see that here, and then Beethoven then superimposes on top of that then a figure that is an inversion of this. And then he adds this trill figure. So, and basically, it's still in four-measure phrases. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he is going to repeat the end of this phrase here. So that's a repetition of that. And so, again, you have that extension of that second phrase. And then you have a little two-measure codetta at the end, just that 5-1 cadence. So on this part three, you're going to have a four-measure phrase, and then you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 measures for a second phrase, and then a little semi-phrase for that codetta. So that is going to be, if you compare this with this, it is the inversion of it, so you're going to say it's a contrasting period. All right, then in the trio section, what we've got is then a shift to F major. The right hand is what you're going to hear as the main melody, and it is centered in the key of F major. And as I said, he then flips the voices, And this is actually the example from the textbook of an evaded cadence where you have an extension at the end of the phrase, so an extra 2 measures here, where it modulates to C major and gives you a cadence on C major. So one general thing that you want to do on your analysis of these is to look at the overall key centers. So this had gone from F minor to A flat major, and then this had, immediately kind of shifts toward B flat minor and cadences on B flat minor here, the subdominant harmony. And then this takes you back to a 5 chord at the end of that retransition, and then you have part 3 that's back in tonic again. And of course that's going to end in tonic at the end of part 3. So here this is first phrase, that's an F major clearly, and then you have this that then starts to modulate and it leads to a cadence on C major. So it goes from F major to its dominant key. All right. Then part 2 begins, just as far as the phrase construction of this. This is a contrapuntal situation. This is the melody now, and it's parallel to that. I think you'd probably call it a parallel period, even though the voices have changed parts. But when we get to this, we have a 4-measure phrase, and then this is a little bit unusual. So the first 4 measures are typical, but then this is just sequencing this material. And it's kind of interesting what Beethoven does, because what he's sequencing throughout all of this is basically a 1-measure unit. So it's this unit right here, this ya da 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 da, and then that's sequenced ya da 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 da, and then sequenced again, and so forth. So he's taking 1-measure ideas. And when we get to this point, you're going to hear then when he brings in the top voice in 8th notes to go against, in parallel motion, the left-hand part, then he's going to add a second voice in the right hand. And that then will give you, 3 voices that are moving in parallel motion. And the figure that he's going to work with is this, da 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 dee da dum, and then he's going to do it again, da 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 dee da dum, and then one more time, da 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 dee da dum, and then it's going to go da da da, and then this is going to shift to groups of 4 notes, ya da da da, and then ya da da da, and then ya da da da, and then ya dee, down by chromatic step. So it kind of has a hemiola effect of this going, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1. So you'll hear that, at that spot. But that's something that he does just by the way that he writes the unit that is being sequenced. So as far as the song form of this one's a little trickier. You've got a 4-measure phrase, another 4-measure phrase that's an extended 4 measures. So, you could look at this as being 3 phrases, that would be then something which all of the phrases would be parallel. And so it's kind of like a, that would be like A, or this would be, starting with the lowercase letters. A prime, A double prime, for that part 2, and then you have a retransition of 3 measures, and then here's part 3, and part 3 is just clearly 2 4-measure phrases there, and so that would be another parallel period. So this could be a phrase group. But you do have that, extension by, repetition at the end. So, at any rate, as far as the final thing that you can look at with this is you could possibly make the connection between this retransition material and the material that you have then in the trio section. Because when you hear it, because it's the continuous 8th note idea, you kind of hear that as being, somehow related. So you could make that connection. But these are the kinds of things that I'm wanting you to talk about, when you go through an analysis of the work. And you're always looking for things that fit your basic expectations for the particular form. And then if there's anything that's unusual, you point that out as well, which makes a work more unique. So this one has a lot of disillusion technique to it, and a lot of phrase extension techniques in it. And it clearly uses that double counterpoint in the trio section. So you've already listened to this, but you might listen to it again and just kind of get it in your ear and kind of get a feel for the way these flow and have a good feel of what to talk about in doing an analysis of a minuet or scherzo in trio.